So yeah, so we're going to be talking about some sensitive stuff and just want to make sure that everybody's aware before we get in. So this is your trigger warning.
Thanks so much, Julie. So today, welcome to Community Connection Hour, an hour-long Q&A community chat on Zoom about resources available during the COVID-19 pandemic and afterwards. So today's special guests are from the South Bay Coalition to End Human Trafficking, and we will be discussing human trafficking, what it looks like and in our area, and how you can help to end human trafficking. Today we are joined by staff from the South Bay Coalition to End Human Trafficking, as well as our Family Learning Center coordinators from multiple branches. So a little bit about the South Bay Coalition to End Human Trafficking. Since the foundation of the National Human Trafficking Resource Center, California continues to have the highest number of human trafficking cases reported to the national hotline than any other state. The South Bay Coalition to End Human Trafficking is one of the oldest collaborative groups focused on combating human trafficking in California and has been operating since 2005. The coalition's vision is a world free from slavery. So thank you so much to Ruth and Sharon for joining us today, and go ahead and take it away.
Thank you so much, Mercedes. I'll go ahead and share my screen as well. I'm Sharan Dhanoa. I'm the Director of Strategic Development for the South Bay Coalition to End Human Trafficking. And I have been working in the field of trafficking for over 10 years now. I started this work in Calcutta, India. And then during law school, I decided this is what I wanted to do and started really tapping into what we're doing here locally. And I'll let Ruth introduce herself as well.
Yes, thank you, Sharon. My name is Ruth Taube, and I'm the Legal Services Chair of the South Bay Coalition to End Human Trafficking. I also am the supervising attorney at the Workers' Rights Program at the Catherine and George Alexander Community Law Center, and I also supervise an advice line through the Office of Labor Standards Enforcement. The legal services, Sharon's going to talk about the composition of the coalition, but legal services is one of the components.
And just as a quick overview, so today we're really going to be looking at really understanding what is trafficking when we talk about human trafficking, give you an idea of what it looks like in our county, Santa Clara, give you an idea of different trends that we're seeing and provide more context, some examples as well. Do a little bit of a deeper dive into some issues that we see, including criminalization of survivors, and then also give you an idea of what different vulnerabilities exist with relation to trafficking in different intersections. And so in terms of talking about the coalition, I'll just give you a quick background. Mercedes already kind of gave you a background in terms of our vision and our mission, but our coalition is made of about 30 agencies. And you can kind of think of us as a quadrant where we have law enforcement agencies, government agencies, including child welfare, probation. Law enforcement is state, but it's also federal. So we've worked with the FBI, San José PD, our DA's office. We have legal service providers, which Ruth mentioned, including Catherine George Alexander Community Law Center, Bay Area Legal Aid, Lacey, a number of individual firms as well that provide pro bono services. We have direct service providers. So our county is really lucky in that we have really good collaboration among a lot of our DV and sexual assault agencies provide holistic direct services. So Community Solutions, the YWCA, AKI, Maitri, and then outreach and community members as well. There are agencies that just really focus on outreach. A lot of our faith-based community also really focuses on outreach and just individual community members. So we really have this broad base of members because we know that survivors can be identified in a number of ways. And we want to make sure that no matter how somebody is identified, that we are able to link them up to services and close any gaps where people might be falling through the cracks and we're missing signs of trafficking. So what is human trafficking? I mean, trafficking really is when somebody is being exploited and they can't leave that situation for some reason. That trafficking can include their exploitation of labor. It could be exploitation of services, or it could be sexual in nature. So when we think of commercial sex, or what sometimes folks consider prostitution, but I'll talk about that later because prostitution is actually different from trafficking, but generally people think of it in that way. So I'll be using the term commercial sex when we're talking about that form of trafficking. And this is actually taken from Polaris Project, which is a really great resource if you're learning about trafficking, in addition to our website. But the federal definition of trafficking is pretty descriptive. You can see here that it breaks it down by sex trafficking and labor trafficking, and I'll explain why in a second. But what we know is that when you're talking about trafficking, you have a number of different actions. And again, I told you that always results in the exploitation of somebody, either for sex or labor or services, but it could be through recruiting, harboring, transporting, buying or selling a person. And the way that it happens is through force, fraud, or coercion. Now, the reason it's split up also is because sex trafficking, if somebody is under the age of 18, they can't consent to sex under law, right? And so you don't need to show force, fraud, or coercion. Just seeing somebody under the age of 18 who's being who's engaging in commercial sex, that in itself is enough to be considered trafficking. And I know that can be a lot. So we also break it down this way. So this might be an easier way of thinking about trafficking. I had mentioned that sometimes you see an action. So traffickers might be somebody who recruits. Traffickers might be the person keeping somebody inside and harboring them. They might be a driver. Maybe they're transporting somebody. They might be buying or selling somebody. These are all individuals who are considered traffickers when we're talking about trafficking. Sorry, I went too far. Force, fraud, and coercion. So this is how it happens. Often I think you assume that there's physical harm, but it can also just be threats of harm. Often trafficking really is psychological. There may be physical restraint, but there may be other things that are really psychological. So you might be holding on to somebody's personal possessions. So you can imagine for some survivors, their traffickers hold on to their passport if they're foreign born, or they hold on to their money. They're really controlling how that person can live. They're really controlling whether or not that person can leave. They may use threats. They can use threats even against their family. If you leave, I'm going to do this to your family back home. So there's a lot of ways that traffickers use psychological coercion to keep somebody in a situation of trafficking. And again, as I said, the purpose of trafficking is either to exploit somebody for their labor or services or for commercial sex. But when we're talking about minors, again, if it's sex trafficking, you don't have to show force, fraud, or coercion. You can just show that action and the purpose.
So I want to talk about the red flags, but just before I do, I want to point out that Sharan was talking about the federal definition. The state definition is pretty much the same. There's still force, fraud, or coercion, but there's also substantial and sustained deprivation of liberty. So it's a little bit of a higher standard than the federal. But in terms of the red flags, you can see lack of knowledge of the community. In other words, the person really doesn't know where they are. They're being moved constantly. That's a real hallmark of trafficking, that people are moved. They don't have many financial possessions or records. They can't leave. That really, when I think of trafficking, I think of you're not free to leave. In other words, through threats, through keeping your passport, through force, through some kind of coercion, you aren't able to leave. In other words, physically, you might be able to walk out the door, but there would be consequences if you left. Also, debt bondage. Actually, if there's debt and the person is working off a debt, then they're not free to leave. There would be consequences, and that is trafficking. And Sharan mentioned that. If they're under 18, they're providing commercial sex, not in control of their passport. There's physical restraint. We see that often. They're not given very much food, no health care. And then, their stories just don't add up. And for domestic born survivors, we often see tattoos, branding. They're not in control of finances. And for youth, we see what's called survival sex, sex work for basic needs, and signs of sexual activity in youth, STD, hickeys, unexplained pregnancies. So how do you figure out who's a survivor? You know, it's not, there's no black and white, there's no litmus test, but how free is the worker to speak to customers? Is somebody watching them and controlling them and they're not free to speak? Can they live wherever they want? Can they quit and go somewhere else without consequences? Are they reasonably paying down the debt? What we've seen a lot with debt bondage is that they've just about paid down the debt and then it gets doubled. This was a recent case, and tripled. And then can they just take off if they want and look at their age? And in regular wage theft cases, wage and hour cases, we see people aren't paid overtime, you know, maybe they're paid below minimum wage, but in trafficking cases, we see they're paid almost nothing. I mean, basically, they're paid very little. And also there's big deductions. They say, well, we're getting a lawyer for you, or we're paying for your room and board. And under state law, you can only take a very small amount out for room and board, and you need a written agreement. But none of them are conclusive. And if you see something, do say something, because one of these red flags might turn out to be very significant. The vulnerabilities and marginalized groups. Yeah, normally traffickers are looking for someone who's vulnerable, someone that doesn't have a support network, people who need something that the trafficker can provide, food insecurity, gender, and Sharon's going to talk a little bit about that, housing insecurity, sexuality, poverty, race, foster youth, and what we call TAY, or transitional aged youth. They like to prey particularly runaways, or people that are kicked out of their house, maybe because of their sexual identity, their gender identity, or sexual orientation, and they are forced to engage in survival sex.
And these are some stats just to kind of break it out some more, because it's really important to understand that when we talk about marginalized groups, trafficking is really in a response to what we see happening generally in our society. When we know that certain groups are already marginalized for a number of reasons, like as Ruth mentioned, individuals may be discriminated against because of their sexual orientation or their gender identity, that really feeds into trafficking. So you can see here some of the overrepresentation. In the US Transgender Survey, 1 in 8 respondents to that survey said they've participated in sex acts for income, so sex work for income. And often we say that this is sex for survival. When people are exchanging sex to meet basic needs, there's a power dynamic and it's exploitive. In another study, 50% of prostituted women reported histories of physical abuse, and an even higher percentage sexual abuse. This is pretty common, where you see in sex trafficking, a lot of individuals who've been trafficked have prior histories of abuse, physical or sexual abuse. And in another study, and this was of youth who were identified as being at risk or being trafficked, 75% of those clients didn't recognize that they were actually being exploited, and so they did not seek help. And this is one of the issues of identification, is it's not as simple as asking someone, are you being trafficked? Because you can see here, especially for minors, they may not even know that they're being trafficked. This is also true for individuals who are foreign born. They may not be familiar with our laws here. They may not know what trafficking is, and that it's considered exploitation. Ruth did mention, so for youth who run away, that street life, makes them very vulnerable. And you can see here in other studies that street life puts youth in close proximity to potential abusers. Youth are propositioned to trade sex in exchange for meeting basic needs. Covenant House did a really great study on this. And it was really shocking to see how many young people are exchanging sex just so they have a place to sleep or have food to eat. And it's really important to talk about how this all relates to different intersectionality. So we know that Black girls and Indigenous girls are trafficked at disproportionately higher rates. This last bullet point is kind of a lot of disproportion in the Black community. You can see that Black women are disproportionately represented among female victims of prostitution-related homicides. They're more likely to be controlled by a pimp. They're more likely to be arrested, have higher fines levied, lose custody of their children, and have more jail time. So this is very significant when we think about how we're intervening on this issue.
Yeah, so the big question that we hear over and over is, why don't people reach out when they're in that situation? The victims or survivors have challenges. There's lack of public awareness. There's lots of myths about what trafficking is. People think it's smuggling. People think you need to have movement from one place to another. People think it's only criminal enterprises. People think that you don't need, that if you have some kind of visa, you can't be trafficked. But you all heard the definition, and none of those things are needed. And victims, I've found over and over when I've presented on this, people come up to me and they tell me stories, and I say, gee, it sounds like you were trafficked. And they kind of look at me blankly because I self-identify. And also it's a hidden crime. It's hard to see it. And the reason victims don't leave is that there's threats of violence. We've had, in almost every case that I've seen, there's been either a threat of violence or a threat to call ICE or the police. And this is very frightening to undocumented workers, and even some documented workers worry that they'll be caught up in that net. But they often say that they'll hurt their loved one. I had one that said they would report and make sure they lost their subsidized housing. Also, they make promises, the Romeo pimp, we'll just do this for a while, we'll get some money and we'll have this beautiful life together. People are afraid of authority. I've found that even when there's a possibility of getting a visa and they have a choice of reporting to a labor agency or the police, they often are afraid. The other thing too, it's kind of a Stockholmish syndrome where the survivors feel loyalty to the person. Well, they brought me here, etc. Also, they don't have an opportunity. I mean, in one of my cases, they were they had them go to the store, but they were monitoring them. They had to call in, they had to text constantly. Also, we had one language barriers who ran away because she was going to be taken to another country. And fortunately, she spoke Spanish. Someone came up to her. She was at a train station and they spoke Spanish and helped her get some help. People are ashamed. They blame themselves. Also, they're often kept in isolation. They may be moved to different places and they don't have contact with other people. They don't know who they can trust. And then, they buy into this whole thing that they owe this money and they have to pay it off. Also, if they keep their passports or their documents, they're not able to leave. Sometimes they're confined. There was one where they kept the person, they locked them in. So that sometimes happens. And other times they're so depressed that they just give up hope. They just figure, I'm resigning myself to this. So human trafficking doesn't happen in a vacuum. We see there's so many overlaps, and that's why we really like our legal services committee, because we have family lawyers, we have immigration lawyers, we have public benefit lawyers that can help with all of these. And often we interview the clients together, but domestic violence and trafficking come together often, and there's a lot of crossover cases with domestic violence. A way to control, sexual assault is often about power and control, and people fear that they're going to be assaulted again. And there's also a lot of violence often in the relationship, sexual assault. I mentioned wage theft. Trafficking is basically about exploiting a person and making money off them, way more money than you would have if the person were free to leave and could quit. And so we definitely see wage theft in every single labor trafficking case, and really in sex trafficking too. Immigration, we see exploitation of undocumented workers. They're able to get a T visa, which is a trafficking visa, if they cooperate with either a labor agency or with law enforcement. They agree to be interviewed, testify at trial if there's a trial, and they can get a green card eventually and citizenship. And then there's U visas for victims of crime. And so also those threats, the ones I mentioned, calling ICE and the police, those constitute witness tampering, extortion, and obstruction of justice. So those are qualifying crimes also for some of those visas. We also see substance use, and we also see survivors being forced to use drugs or sell drugs. So we had one with a marijuana grow house as well.
So what does human trafficking look like in Santa Clara County? Well, there's no general prevalence studies because it's a really hard crime to identify. Often labor trafficking looks like it's happening in everyday life. And then with sex trafficking, it often gets looked at as just illegal commercial sex. So we're going to show you some stats that give you an idea of how survivors are identified. So Ruth is going to give you an overview of some of the numbers that we see of survivors who are receiving services. And then I'll also give you a quick snapshot of what we're seeing in terms of arrest numbers, which might give us an idea.
Yes, in this county for fiscal year 2021, we had 276 survivors, 141 of sex trafficking, adults and minors, 53 labor, and 78 young adults at risk. And we call trafficking of children or minors, often CSEC, commercial sexual exploitation. And there's also TAY, which is the transitional age youth. This is broken down into gender and age, and you can see 26 to 40 there's 73, but the largest number is under 18, there's 97, 18 to 25 is 59, 41 to 60, there's still 37, and over 60, there's 5. And for gender, cisgender females are the largest, 239, cis male 29, and then we've got transgender females 5, transgender males 2, and gender non-conforming 3.
And I just want to point out again, these are individuals who've been connected to services. So don't confuse it with prevalence,
right,
because it may not be individuals that we're able to identify.
Yeah, it's kind of like an iceberg. The ones that come forward are on the top, but there's just so many beneath that. But these are the ones that we've been able to identify. And one of the myths is that it's mainly foreign nationals that are trafficked, but actually, as you can see, 169 from the United States. And because, we're contiguous to Mexico, there's a big number, 48, but really they're from all over. That we have 17 from China. We get a lot of Filipino caregivers, Vietnam, nail salon, but other type of work like caregiving and others. But you can see there's Africa too. We really have had clients from all over, other Asian countries, Africa, and other parts of Europe like Russia. And in terms of race and ethnicity, Hispanic or Latinx, they're the largest, 129, Asian 46, and then people are more than one race, 22, white that are non-Latino or Latinx are 34, and American Indian. I mean, the missing and murdered Indigenous women, there's really very high numbers, but in this county, these are the ones that came forward, 3.
And I also just want to point out that sometimes I think we tend to form stereotypes, but really, like as Ruth pointed out, we've seen survivors from everywhere in the world,
Right.
Including the US. And so there's no community that is immune from this. And you might see different trends or patterns, which we'll talk about, but it's really important to keep your mind open to knowing that really anybody could be vulnerable to trafficking from anywhere in the world.
I did want to point out that besides that, I mentioned that they target vulnerable people, but every time I do a presentation, there's someone who isn't in that vulnerable group who comes forward and says, you know, that somebody, they got a job abroad and they wanted to keep their passport or something similar. So it's primarily vulnerable groups, but it's not only vulnerable groups.
And so here I actually wanted to point out another way that we start to look at information. And you might be wondering, well, why are we looking at arrests when we're talking about victims? Well, I'll talk about it a little bit more later, but really we do see survivors are criminalized, especially when we talk about commercial sex, or what is still on the books is considered as prostitution, which you can see here. This is just from, and San Jose Police Department is a very strong partner of ours. They have a really good human trafficking unit, but they also have a lot of officers who may not be as well trained on the issue of trafficking. And so if they come across somebody that they believe is selling sex, and in that 5-minute interaction, they're not able to identify if they're a trafficking survivor, in their minds, they may consider that to be the crime of prostitution. And so what you see here is from January 2015 to September of 2019, there were a lot of arrests, and 813 of those were for individuals who are 18 to 24 years old. We keep saying transitional age youth. That's the age range for transitional age youth. So on the one hand, we know that transitional age youth are very vulnerable because they're still developing. If they were in the foster care system, they might lose access to support systems, or, you know, many young people lose access to support systems when they turn 18 anyways. And they're considered adults by law. So you can see that over 55% of these arrests for prostitution are for young people in that age range. So what we're hoping to do is continue to advocate and raise awareness. Can we better identify if some of these 18 to 24 years are actually engaging in sex work for basic needs? Can we connect them to services? Are there ways that we can increase our outreach to assist? So it's good to look at data in that way to see what are we missing. It's also important when we talk about that disproportion. You can see, again, looking at these arrest numbers, we mentioned disproportionate impact on Black women, and we definitely see that in our county. Over 55% of arrests were African-American, primarily women. And you do see a breakdown also when we look at Asian, which is really important because our county is 40% Asian. So we really need to look at that group more in depth. As well. And so when we think about illicit massage establishments, that disproportionately impacts Chinese women or Korean women. We have a very large Vietnamese population, so we are starting to see some residential brothels, things like that disproportionately impacting there. But again, these are arrest numbers. So can we do better about identifying survivors? And so here are some overarching trends we'll do a little bit of a deeper dive on as well. I mentioned illicit massage establishments and residential brothels, and those disproportionately impact adult women from Asia, including China and Korea. There are a lot of massage establishments in our county. Not all of them are illicit. Not all of them engage in sexual activity. And a lot of the women who work in these are actually being trafficked for their labor. So they may not be paid properly, and you may not see an intersection with sex. So we definitely see this as a very big trend in our county. Residential brothels are what you see with those huge, we have a lot of huge apartment complexes throughout our county. You may start to notice, this one apartment always has men coming and going at all times of the night. When you start to see things like that, that's a pretty big red flag of, something else is going on here, and you may want to contact, San Jose Police Department's Human Trafficking Unit or the Polaris number, which we'll provide. COVID-19, a lot of folks thought that COVID-19 might slow down things. It's actually made trafficking a lot worse. And you see that they're increasing vulnerabilities, with people out of work. When we have unstable housing situations, that's a huge vulnerability. And so we're actually seeing trafficking has increased. You can see more street level commercial sex happening. So that's something to keep in mind. The other really big thing about COVID is young people are online more when schooling went online. If you have a digital literacy gap where the parents aren't as familiar with the internet or how things work, that child is extremely vulnerable. And you may be thinking, well, they're just inside their home. A lot of exploitation starts in ways like what we call sextortion or self-production. So you might have a young person, and sometimes this is like a 10-year-old or an 8-year-old who's chatting with what they believe is another young person online, and they start having a conversation. And then that young person, if it's a young girl who's 8, she thinks she's speaking to another 8-year-old female who says, "I'm going with my mom to buy my first training bra. What kind did you get? Send me a picture." And as soon as they have a picture, they start to use that to then say, "I'm going to give this to all your friends if you don't give me more." So that's how we actually see, even if you believe somebody's in their home and they're safe, that exploitation can start to happen in that way. And online, we see a lot of individuals being sold for sex online. Generational trafficking, it's really, we see that happening where if somebody's born into a situation of vulnerability where either their parents are being exploited, or the parents might engage in exploitation themselves. Ruth will talk more about labor, but we see the construction industry is really very vulnerable to trafficking, especially when we have subcontractors, and we also see intersections with gang-involved youth.
So I did want to talk a little bit about a particular part of federal law that's really significant and that has made its appearance in San Jose. So we're increasingly seeing lawsuits against hotels and motels. And this TVPRA, that's the federal trafficking law, Trafficking Victims Protection. It's been reauthorized, so that's the R Act. And you can sue, this is civilly, not criminally, the perpetrator, the trafficker, or whoever knowingly benefits financially and knew or should have known that there was trafficking. And I'm sure immediately it comes to mind that the people who do that are possibly motel or hotel owners. So the next slide is an example of some lawsuits. In Florida, $100 million, and these are big hotels: Best Western, La Quinta, Fairfield Inn, and Gulf Coast. There's a lawsuit in Houston, Texas against a lot of the big ones. And in 2019, there were 25 new cases, and they were against the Marriott, Red Roof Inn, and Hilton. So right here in San Jose, on the next slide, there was not that long ago, January 30th, 2020, a civil suit against Super 8 on the Alameda. Our law center is on the Alameda, right very close to it. The Clarion Inn on Monterey Road, we all know these roads, and Motel 6 on Fontaine Road. And they sought $9.99 million. And you might think, oh, this is just a little motel, but really the Super 8 is owned by Wyndham, GC Hospitality owns Motel 6, and Choice owns the Clarion. So I did want to walk you through a labor trafficking example because it's a little different. Yeah, I see here, it's down the street from the Bill Wilson Center. Yes, it's very close to all of us. So it's happening right here. A lot of people think it's not. That's one of the myths. So in this one, this is a typical one of our cases. Mr. Sanchez, the names have been changed, went to Mexico. He offered Maria a job taking care of his 2 young kids for $15 an hour. That's below minimum wage, but that's in San Jose, but that's not the point here. He actually, in reality, he talked to the parents, they were all on board, and everyone thought this was this great opportunity. And then as soon as he got her to the US, he took her passport. And he said she'd be taking care of his 2 young kids. But he had her actually work in one of his care homes 6 days a week, and she didn't get any money. And it's trafficking. It's not just wage theft, because he threatened that if she left, he would call ICE. And he also slapped her. And later he paid her $400 a month when she threatened to leave. He said, okay, I'll start paying you, but $400 a month was not enough. And you remember we talked about force, fraud, and coercion. Those were the means. So there's the following elements: force, a slap, he slapped her; coercion, he threatened to call ICE; and fraud, he lied about the work and pay. There only needs to be one, but here there's all 3 of them. And you remember I mentioned that, and Sharan did too, that basically they're working or being forced to engage in commercial sex against their will. That's the involuntary, against your will, servitude, serving or working for someone. So here, and this is substantial and sustained. He took her passport, he threatened her, he slapped her. So under state or federal law, you could bring a civil trafficking case, and the DA, the US attorney, one of the prosecutors could bring a criminal case.
And so this brings me back to, what I was saying before, is why do we then see some individuals as survivors, and then we see some individuals are being criminalized? But there's a lot of kind of bigger picture issues there. And some, more nuanced issues. So early on, we were talking about a lot of survivors of trafficking don't know that they're survivors. And if we are depending on somebody to come forward and say, I'm a survivor of trafficking, help me, we're not going to see very many people doing that. And so, especially for law enforcement, when they're interacting with somebody, they have to be able to really tease out questions to help somebody maybe potentially disclose. One thing we know, though, is that for survivors, a lot of times they've had negative interactions with law enforcement or other authority systems. So for foster youth, they may have very negative interactions with child welfare. So they may not trust coming forward and saying, these things are happening to me. They really are focusing on survival. And if their trafficker is providing them with a roof over their head and with food, we have to be able to convince them that we can do better. And so often we're not getting disclosures. Service providers also will tell us, and our service providers are confidential. So that means that they have a very protected space. But even then, when they're working with clients who they see all these indications of trafficking, it may still take even up to a year for somebody to disclose that, yes, I've been, exploited in this way. So it really goes to show that it's very hard to get individuals to disclose the full extent of this exploitation. And so that it makes it really difficult to be able to connect them to services unless we do more work. There's a term called adultification, and we talk about this in a lot of different ways, but it really impacts some communities more than others. At its very basis, it's when we see young people and we assign them or have expectations of them to act like an adult when they really aren't. That really as a whole applies to transitional age youth, right? We say under the law, you're over 18. So you should know, you should be doing this. There's a lot of shoulds. You should be behaving in this way. You should know that this is illegal. But then all science and research tells us that young people up to the age of 25, their brain is developing. On top of that, if we're talking about young people who have histories of sexual abuse or physical abuse, often that really impedes development. Trauma impacts your brain. And so if you see individuals who have a history of trauma, then they also have kind of more development to do in a healing space that could really impact how they're behaving. So we see adultification happening in our school system, in our healthcare system, and especially when we're talking about arrests. Often I'll hear people saying, if we're talking about young women that they see selling sex on the street, and you ask them, well, how old do they look? Well, she's acting like, an adult woman, but she's actually 13 or 14, right? So we really have to kind of check our own biases when we're talking about these things. And there are communities, again, it comes back to expectations. If there are communities that have had negative interactions with different systems, then we really have to work with those systems to change their approach so that they can build, more consistency and build a better relationship. We definitely see this with law enforcement, but we see it with all systems. We see this with family law. We see it with our immigration system. And then at the end of the day, society marginalizes individual members of society. In the very beginning, we said that, individuals who, identify with the LGBTQ plus community are extremely vulnerable. And it's because we see discrimination. Transgender individuals are extremely discriminated against, just generally in terms of employment, generally in society. So that's a huge vulnerability that we as a society are perpetuating. So we really need to expand how we embrace community and know that when we embrace community, we're protecting our most marginalized individuals. And the other thing to think about, so another question I get, is how can you tell if somebody is a survivor of sex trafficking or a sex worker? And my answer to you is you don't need to make that determination. One thing that's really important to know is that there's a lot of research that shows how harmful engaging in commercial sex is. And this is for a number of reasons. A lot of them are societal reasons. But you can see that here's a chart from Dr. Kim Chang. She's one of the co-founders of the HEAL Network, which focuses really on the healthcare system and trafficking. But these are some of the health-related risks specific to trafficking, where you see a lot of STIs, unintended pregnancies, malnutrition, poor oral health. Of course, there's a number of mental health issues. PTSD is very common. What we call complex trauma, so trauma that's from a number of different things that have happened. Suicidal ideation, substance abuse or substance use. Substances are used in a variety of different ways when we're talking about trafficking. It can be used by the trafficker to control somebody. It can be used by the victim to suppress their appetite or to stay awake and alert if they're homeless so that they can watch their belongings. It can be used as a coping mechanism to deal with past trauma, current trauma, and being able to just function in society. You may find individuals dissociate. So sometimes when you watch police interviews with survivors of trafficking, you'll see that the law enforcement officer doesn't quite understand why the survivor can't remember things or doesn't seem that emotional about abuse that may have happened. And that's from dissociation. Again, this is a result of trauma. One of the biggest things we do want folks to know is don't have expectations of how somebody should behave when they have had such a horrific form of trauma, right? Or any form of trauma, really, but you should not have expectations of how someone would behave when we're talking about trauma. And then social health risks, stigmatization. You can imagine for a lot of survivors, if they have any arrests on their record, which a lot do, especially when we talk about sex trafficking, it's hard for them to get jobs, or they may be harassed at their job if they have things on their record. And here on the right side, you'll see sex workers and violence. Now, there's a lot of research that shows that just being engaged in sex work, there are high rates of violence. And you can imagine if you're a survivor of trafficking, that's even higher. But these numbers are extremely high. Their homicide rate is 17 times higher than the general public. Mortality, so from different health reasons, can be 200 times greater than the general population. And then rates of violence are 40 to 90%, depending on the study that you're looking at. So again, coming back to what I was saying, you don't have to decide where somebody is, whether they're a sex worker or a survivor of trafficking. Just know there's so many harms associated with engaging in commercial sex. It's always worth considering, can we connect this individual to some form of services? Can we figure out what might be helpful for them? Maybe it is medical care. Maybe it is being able to connect them to a counselor. Maybe it is really just employment or connecting them to stable housing, which is huge. So just keeping our mind open to that. And here also, again, it's that conversation of who's trafficked, who's a sex worker. If we're really just focusing on people disclosing, then it's going to be very rare that we find individuals who disclose that they're being trafficked. And we know that for a lot of individuals who are trafficked, it's not either or. So you might have somebody who was trafficked as a minor. So let's say they were groomed and then they were trafficked at the age of 15, and now they're 18 years old. And as an adult now, law enforcement will have to show there's force, fraud, or coercion. Now, if they can't show that, does that suddenly mean that person's a sex worker and they're not a survivor? No. Or what if at the age of 19, they no longer have a trafficker or a pimp, which we prefer not to use, we say trafficker. Does that mean that they no longer are a victim? You know, for us, you'll see survivors, it's not always linear, right? You might see a survivor who then re-engages as a sex worker for survival purposes, you know? And so I think it's, again, coming back to it, it's not always either or, and it's not really that important for us as society to determine whether or not somebody falls into that definition, as much as being able to point to how can we provide services. So if they want to leave the situation, which we know there are a lot of harms associated with, can we connect them to housing? Can we connect them to substance use services? Or even meeting some of the basic needs like food. And just in our last, I guess we have a couple more minutes, we wanted to just let you know there's tons of things you can do. So we've been mentioning the human trafficking hotline, which is 888-373-7888. That's run by the Polaris Project. One thing to know about this hotline is that they have specific protocols for each county. So when you call this number, if you say, you know, I'm in Santa Clara County and there it looks like there's a situation over at this hotel, they actually have the human trafficking unit within San Jose PD. They can give them the tip. We can also, I'll put it in the chat after when we're taking questions, but you can also contact directly our agencies. So, you know, and I was going to mention this earlier as well, you know, our service providers, if you feel anything in this presentation today triggered something for you and you want to speak to a confidential advocate, I'm going to include the Community Solutions 24-hour hotline in the chat, so you can go ahead and give them a call. That's also a phone number where if you meet somebody and you know that they want to access services, that's a phone number you can give them to call to access services. And in our county, we try to make it easy in the sense that we have one agency who will help distribute all the cases. So it's called a point agency system. So for law enforcement, if they've identified a survivor of trafficking and they know that individual wants services, they'll call Community Solutions. Community Solutions will work with their partner agencies and say, okay, well, this individual is Mandarin speaking, so we're going to connect them to Aki where they can have a case manager who's Mandarin speaking. So it's one phone number that helps in that way. We really hope that folks will learn the red flags for trafficking so you can start to identify. And again, you don't need to determine if it's trafficking, you just need to know, are there red flags here? And, you know, trust your gut feeling. Should I report it? And everybody has different spheres of influence. You know, there you have your community. You may have, you know, your professional community, your personal community. You know, think about, do they know what to look for when it comes to trafficking? You know, do your neighbors? Think about who your influence spheres are and think about how you can share information about trafficking. And lastly, don't participate, right? You know, if it seems too good to be true, like, you know, people will ask me, well, you know, what about those nail salons where you get a $10 manicure? I mean, if it doesn't seem like it makes sense, it probably doesn't. So somebody is paying for that manicure, but it's often the workers when you're paying so low prices for things like that. You can also check out Slavery Footprint, which has an interesting way of thinking through all the things that we consume and how that ties to trafficking. And Ruth, did you want to add anything else about what you can do? Oh, you're on mute. I think you're in mute.
That the human trafficking.
Uh-oh, muted again. Sorry, Ruth.
Sorry. The human trafficking hotline also has a text option 233733, be free. Yeah, and if you do see any type of exploitation that has to do with someone at work and it looks strange, you might see someone on a street corner selling fruit, because we've had fruit vendor cases, or vegetables or some food. You can call, we have an advice line, Office of Labor Standards Enforcement through the county advice line, and I'll put the phone number on there. And we have lawyers on that line. It's free. Oh, Sharon put it on there. Yeah, it's 866-870-7725. 1 is English, 2 is Spanish, 3 is Vietnamese, 4 is Tagalog or Visayan, and 5 is Mandarin. And if you want, yeah, you can call our law center as well. We have at the Alexander Law Center, and the phone number is 408. I'll put it in the chat, 288-7030. And we do have immigration lawyers too. We also have a consumer lawyer who does notario fraud cases as well. Are there any questions?
That was a really, really great, informative presentation. Thank you so much, Ruth and Sharon. We can go ahead and take questions now if we have any from any of our participants.
I'm curious, what was the last number that you put in the chat, the 408-288?
Oh, sorry, that's the Catherine, and I'll write that down. Catherine and George Alexander Community Law Center. It's part of Santa Clara University School of Law. And we have a clinic where we assist clients with employment issues, and also our immigration lawyer does a lot of trafficking cases and crossover cases with domestic violence and others. And we handle wage theft cases and civil trafficking cases as well. So you can call that number. Oh, Sharon, do you want to explain slavery footprint?
Oh, sure. So if you just Google slavery footprint, it should bring up a website where basically you enter different information about yourself. It's basically a interesting way for consumers to learn about what is, your participation in trafficking without you really even knowing, because there's a lot of labor trafficking in the cotton industry, for example. So if you're wearing cotton, there's a high likelihood that there may be trafficking associated with it, and we don't even know. And one of the reasons why it's hard to know for us as consumers is for a lot of these big, industries like cotton, you may have one company that's buying cotton from 10 different places all over the world. And you have these middlemen who are selling all the cotton. And so every time you start adding in people in between a supply chain, then it starts to muddy. Where is this coming from? And where is that coming from? Well, we know certain areas, there's a lot of trafficking for, let's say cotton. I think there's a lot of trafficking in Kazakhstan. And so, but how do we know that something we're wearing connects there? So slavery footprint will start to give you an idea about the things that you engage with every day and how that touches human trafficking. I give some local examples also, right? Where if we're paying really cheap amounts of money for, like I gave the example of the manicure, then there's a high likelihood there might be wage theft there. That person isn't getting paid properly because it's a very low amount of money for what that service is. When we think about subcontractors, so we've had big case of silvery towers, or if you Google it, slavery towers, you'll see that there was a big, building that was being built, and they used subcontracting with the contractors. Those subcontractors weren't paying their workers. But the main building, they didn't know that because they just hired the subcontractor. Oh, this is what you're bidding of how much we pay you, and then you'll pay your employees. So they don't pay attention to what those employees are actually getting paid. In fact, they were being completely exploited and kept in a warehouse, locked at night. So I kind of went off tangent from slavery footprint, but really just to get you to think about, that's a good starting point to think about how in your everyday life you might be intersecting with trafficking.
Wow.
Wonderful.
Sharon, can you
sorry,
tell
Victoria,
us?
Victoria, just one
Oh.
second. We are at time, but if Sharon and Ruth don't mind staying just a few more minutes to answer some questions.
Sure.
Thank you, everybody. So go ahead, Victoria. Sorry.
Oh, no problem. This is the first time I've ever heard that human trafficking is a silent crime. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's an invisible crime in the sense that, you know, especially with labor trafficking, you may not get a sense. You might walk into a restaurant and you order your food and you don't have a sense of how the workers in the back are being paid or how your wait staff is being paid, right? You know, you have to kind of get to know somebody to get a better sense of, are they actually getting paid properly? Maybe these workers are all living in the same establishment, and the employer or the trafficker is controlling when they come and go. They're the ones holding their money. They might be holding their passport. So we, as, you know, everyday public, it's hard to see. Even with sex trafficking, you know, a number of society members, you know, if you see somebody who's out on the street selling sex, the assumption is they're choosing to be there. And they'll say, well, nobody's standing around them. So if they, you know, if they're a victim, why don't they just walk away? So we kind of have these blinders on of how we expect someone to behave when they're actually being exploited. When we think about the agricultural industry, there's a lot of labor issues there where somebody might not be paid. And again, you think, well, there's nobody standing over them with a, you know, forcing them to work. So why don't they just leave? So we have these blinders on how we expect somebody who's being exploited to behave. Because of that, it ends up being a lot harder to identify. Does that help? Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. Do we have any more questions from everyone listening in? If not, if anyone does have any questions, feel free to email any of the FLCs from the library, and we will be sure to get those questions over to Sharon and Ruth. Thank you so much, Sharon and Ruth, for being here today and for taking the time to inform us all about human trafficking and what it looks like in Santa Clara County. Thank you, everybody, so much for coming, and we will be picking up our financial literacy speaker series next Thursday to finish out the month strong with that. So thank you, everybody, and we hope to see you again soon. Bye,
Thank you.
Bye, guys. Have a great day.
Bye. Thank you.